Alright, good morning guys, let's go and get started. Thanks for being patient after Tuesday. Traffic, it was bad. I think there was an accident or something, so I was like, I don't want to make you guys stick around for that long, so thanks for your patience there. We're going to try and get through as much as we can today since we missed on Tuesday, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So kind of continuing where we left off last week, we talked about why we're learning HTML and CSS and JavaScript, which is so that, we can understand the technologies that the web is built on. Every website uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so that's kind of why we're digging into that, even though there's all kinds of tools that let us, make websites really easily. This is kind of the underlying technology for all of those. So what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's the language used to describe the structure of a web page. So we talked a little bit about this last week. So the HTML provides the content and the structure and the meaning to the content. It doesn't have anything to do with the styling or, in theory, the display, or even necessarily the functionality, other than like forms and links and stuff like that. But other, drag and drop, stuff like that is all going to be JavaScript. HTML is composed of elements that include an opening tag and a closing tag. And the closing tag is identified by a slash at the beginning. So this is what an element looks like. So you use these angle brackets with the tag name inside the brackets, and that's the start tag. Then in between your start tag and your end tag, you have content. So it's just some text, a heading or a paragraph or some other information goes inside your tag. And then your end tag has the slash at the beginning. So that's how you know it's the end tag. So it's very, very important that every start tag has an end tag. Tags can be nested inside one another, but you don't want to, start one tag, start another tag, close your first tag, and then close your second tag. They need to be, well structured so that one tag closes, and any tags inside of it need to be self-contained as well. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit more. The element is this whole thing. So the start tag, the closing tag, and the contents, all of that big chunk, including any other tags inside of here, that's our element. Web page structure. So ultimately, web pages are documents made up of various elements. So headings, paragraphs, lists, links, etc. Images. These pages contain a hierarchy of information. So, we've got headings and subheadings. We've got lists. We can have nested lists. So think of like a, some sort of a document or like a magazine article or even like a PowerPoint slide like this. It has a structure to it, right? We've got like a heading up here with kind of the title of the page. Then we've got a list, and within that list is two nested lists. We could have a paragraph, we could have subheadings. Think about what that content is structured like. That's what the HTML provides. It goes from just being straight text to kind of providing some structure to our content. And yeah, elements can be nested within each other. So for instance, we've got, a list element here with list items. Then we've got another list inside of this list item, so on and so forth. So we've got nested elements. The entire web page is wrapped by an HTML tag. So it's just HTML. It's just indicating that it's HTML. Very important tag. If you don't have that, the browser's not going to know that it's HTML that it's rendering. The head tag comes just after the HTML tag and contains some information about the page. So it's kind of metadata. It's not necessarily visible to the users other than the title tag, but it's kind of some information about your page. So the title tag goes inside your head tag and gives the page a title, which shows up in the title bar of your browser. So you see up here, like how it says, the lecture name up here. That information up there in the title bar of your browser, that comes from the title tag. So whatever you put in the title tag is what shows up there. Or like if you've got tabs, it will be on the tab name. So like it'll show the title on the tab. The body tag comes after the closing head tag and wraps everything that appears in the main browser window. So everything that actually shows up on your page goes inside the body tag. these elements are all required for an HTML page. So the HTML tag, head, title, and body are all required elements. You have to have them. The browsers usually, depending on which ones you miss, will kind of fill in the blanks for you and still render your page. But in order to be, valid HTML, meeting the specification for HTML, you need to include those tags. So here's kind of what just a basic HTML page looks like, right, using the tags we've talked about so far. So we've got our HTML tag at the top, and that wraps everything. So the whole document is wrapped in the HTML tag. We've got our head tag, which includes our title tag, and then my website is our title, and that's what would show up in the title bar of the browser. We close our head tag, right, because that's the end of our head information. Then we start the body tag, which includes everything that will actually be displayed on the page. So inside of our body tag, we've got an H1, which is a heading. We've got a paragraph. We've got a list with some list items. You notice there's a structure to our HTML as well. So like we've got nested tags here, but this H1 closes before we open some new tag. But here we've got our UL, which has nested tags in it, but those all close before we close our UL. So really important that you don't mix up your opening and closing tags. So then we close our body, and we close our HTML. So everything in the body tag is what will actually show on the page. It's also important to note too, indentation is pretty important with HTML. Technically, it doesn't matter. You can not indent these lines at all. You can have all of your HTML on one line if you wanted, because of the way that it uses tags to specify your content. It doesn't really matter how it's indented, except for you when you're writing your HTML. The indentation is very important because it helps you see the structure of your page, right? So anytime we open a tag, we put any elements that go inside of that element indented another level in. So that way we can kind of visually see the structure of our HTML. It's really important because, here we close our LI, and we know we need to go over one to close our UL. So if you miss something somewhere, you should be able to see that a little bit more easily if you've got things properly indented. So again, generally you just want to indent anything that is nested inside of another tag. It's the best practice. Again, you don't have to. You can have your indentation however you want. But generally, that's the best practice. Most people in the industry will indent things this way. There are some services, some software and stuff that'll minify your HTML or your CSS for you and compress it all into one line so it's really tiny, so there's less characters for the users to download. You can mess with that if you want, but as far as for when you're writing your HTML and your CSS, give yourself as much space as you need to make your structure clear. Really, really helpful. I can't tell you how many times. In regular code, if you do Java or PHP or JavaScript even, you want to kind of do the same thing. Your indentation sort of helps you see visually the structure of your code. And if you miss a closing parentheses or something, you can usually kind of figure out where it's supposed to go based on your indentation. So pretty important. Okay, element attributes. So attributes provide additional information about the contents of an element. So they appear on the opening tag, and they have a name and a value. So here's like a start tag here. We've got the tag name. Then as an option, we've got an attribute name, and you do like equals, and then inside parentheses is your value. Show some examples later of actual attributes that you would use. But so again, they include a name and a value. The value should be wrapped in quotes. Generally, attributes have no practical effects by themselves. So other than you might have used the style attribute for your first assignment if you were doing the extra credit. The style attribute will allow you to actually do some styling and stuff, but generally attributes aren't supposed to modify the style or necessarily change anything about your element, other than to provide information to your CSS or to provide information to your JavaScript. So you're kind of trying to describe your element a little more so these other technologies can interact with it properly. So again, don't worry too much about these until we get into some specific examples like using IDs and classes and things like that. So here's an example with some attributes, so kind of a more realistic HTML page. So here we use a style tag or a style element, which you may have used in the extra credit. We'll talk about this a little more when we get into CSS, but generally using the style attribute is not the recommended way anymore of providing style information. We want to use our CSS for that. It may even be deprecated at some point. I'm not sure, but you don't really want to use the style attribute very often unless you absolutely have to for some reason. But it's a valid attribute that you can provide. ID is also a really common attribute, so it's a unique identifier for this element. So it's got a main as the ID of this heading. Class is another attribute we can use. For something like an image, you have attributes that provide information about the image as well. So like the source, which is the URL, the file name of the image, very important for our image to have load. We'll also use an alt attribute to provide kind of a description of our image, so that screen readers or even just if the image doesn't load for some reason, it'll show the description instead of the image. So really useful. So this is kind of an example of what those attributes look like. So we've got the name, and then inside quotes is the value of the attribute. Okay, viewing HTML source. So view source is really important. It allows you to see the HTML of any website in your browser. So different browsers do it differently, but in Chrome you do view and then developer and then view source, or in Firefox it's tools and web developer and page source, but it will show you the HTML for any website that you're looking at. Really important, HTML is how your browser renders the page, so you can see the actual HTML for any page. Even better than view source, in my opinion, is developer tools, which all browsers now have. I'm not sure that Safari has them. I think there's some way to do it, but I haven't figured that out. But it gives you an actual interactive view of your HTML, so you can kind of look at each element. Usually, it'll highlight the element on the page that you're looking at in your developer tools, and it'll allow you to change the CSS. You can even change the HTML a little bit. And you can rewrite stuff, you can delete elements, you can move stuff around, and it'll reflect that on the page. It's really, really awesome. So that's how you open it in Chrome or Firefox. Usually you can right-click anywhere on the page and click Inspect Element, and it'll actually load the element that you right-clicked on in your developer tools. So I think, yeah, so here's what developer tools look like. I'll show you a demonstration of it as well. But it'll pop up something like this, and you'll see the HTML here. And over here are the styles related to that attribute or that element. And so you can change anything that you see. You can edit the HTML in there. You can also change the styles. It's pretty nice. Okay. That's the end of that lecture. Let me show you a little bit what developer tools looks like, just to kind of show you a live view. Oh, page source. Command U, or web developer, and then page source. So the page source will actually open your HTML in a new tab, which is pretty cool. It's not really very well formatted. They've got a ton of JavaScript at the beginning of their page. Yeah, so you don't actually, and there's not a lot of HTML in here anyway. And yeah, they've got it all kind of minified and compressed, so this isn't really a very good example. Let me pull up like my personal site, because it's got great HTML. That's really easy to read. So if we do tools, web developer, page source, there you can see the actual HTML that renders that page. So really nice feature, especially if you just want to kind of get an overview of the HTML of a page. View source is good to kind of be able to scroll through it, see what it looks like. But doing developer tools, so if we right click on something and click inspect element, it gives us this kind of more interactive view, kind of a more dynamic look at things. So over here you see all the HTML. So like this is what we right clicked on, was this H1. So whatever you right click on is what will open up. by default. So if we right click this one, it opens up this H2. And so like we can edit this. Like if you double click, you can say, you know, say I'm not a web developer anymore. I'm going to be a programmer. It'll actually update the page. So really nice. After you get used to using this a little bit, you'll no longer trust screenshots of websites because you'll see that anybody can edit any website and make it say whatever they want to and take a screenshot of it. Now, granted, this doesn't save the website. This is loaded from my server. If you pull it up in your browser, it's not going to show my edits because this is just editing my local view of the page. So you can't actually like hack into someone's website and change it. But I could take a screenshot of this and email it to someone and say, hey, look what Craig's website says. It says something crazy. And they'd have to verify it for themselves to see that it was false, to see that I had edited it. So super, super cool. And you can, you know, kind of expand, you know, I've got divs here with the inspector. You can kind of poke around and you can see it highlights what I'm looking at here. So, you know, I've got this paragraph selected and it kind of highlights where the paragraph is. Even tells you the sizes of things, which is awesome, super, super useful. Granted, that's kind of, you know, what's calculated based on how much information is in that paragraph, but I can't tell you how amazing Inspector is because we didn't used to have it even like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And so it was a huge pain. But now you can just, and so like we can drag stuff around. Like I can just click this H3 and move it up here if I want to and see, you know, where it goes. So now it's up here. You can like right click on something and say edit as HTML. And then you just get all of the HTML here that you can edit. So, you know, so I wanted this H2 to be an H3. And see what that looks like. Then you click away from it. Now it looks a little bit different because it's an H3 instead. Super, super awesome. You can also change the styling over here. So when we get into CSS, this will be very, very useful. So we've got this H3 selected. So over here on the right, it shows us all of the styles that are applied to that H3. So it's got a color set, it's got a font set, and you can just click this checkbox to uncheck that style and see what changes. Really, really nice. You can just uncheck the font and see what the default font is. You can even see where that style comes from. So these two styles come from this CSS selector. Again, once we get into CSS, you'll see how useful this is. This comes from style.css line 61. So you can pinpoint exactly where that style is coming from. Super, super useful. You can change the style, so we can say, you know, we want this color to be red. Now the color's red. We can see what that looks like. So most of the times when I'm doing, you know, design work and kind of, you know, front end stuff like this, I do most of the work in the browser through the inspector and, you know, do the HTML. I'll write my styles in the browser. And then once I'm happy with how it looks, I'll copy and paste, you know, the styles that I wrote into my actual CSS file. It's just so easy to do it here where you can really visually see the changes. Really, really awesome. You can also do mobile view as well. So like Firefox, I actually don't like Firefox is as good. It has this responsive, if you click this guy right here, it'll open in a different size and you can choose like what size you want, or you can choose the device. So if we wanted to see what it looks like on Google Nexus 7, it'll change the size to that, or an iPhone 6s. So now we've got a mobile version right here and we can see how it looks. Actually, like, that's not what I wanted. Chrome's Inspector I find a little bit better than Firefox, especially for mobile. So usually anytime I'm doing mobile work, I'll open it up in Chrome. So Chrome's, it's this icon right here that looks like a little bit of a mobile device. And so you can choose, again, same thing, choose your size. It actually changes to a touch icon for your cursor, so you can actually do some touch events and stuff. So that's what's kind of nice about it. So you're like pretending to scroll kind of a thing. So anyway, super, super useful. Every browser has, you know, inspector tools of some sort. It's the most useful thing as a web developer. It's almost like cheating a little bit. in a good way. Even like, so like if I, let me select like this H3 here, just to show you how much like cheating it is. It'll like autofill stuff. So I could say like, font, and it shows me all of the, these are CSS attributes, style attributes. We'll cover all of these, in class. But, it could say, oh, okay, cool. I have, font family. And then it shows you what the options are. So really, really nice. It'll sort of fill in the blanks a little bit for you when it comes to CSS. So really, really nice. I could go on about this forever. But if you do something numerical, so like font size, we'll do like 8 pixels. You can click in here and kind of use your up and down arrow as well to kind of increment and decrement, which is really nice if you're trying to get something to fit just right and see, exactly what size you want it. Anyway, super useful. It was the best thing for web development in a long time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about some specific HTML elements. So this is lecture 2. We're going to try and get through all of this today, and then I'll talk about the next assignment a little bit. So we're talking about text, lists, and links today. So again, to recap, HTML uses tags to wrap our content and give the document structure and meaning. The entire HTML document is wrapped in the HTML tag. The head is at the beginning of the document and contains metadata information. There's other stuff other than the title that goes inside the head. We'll cover those a little bit later. Some meta tags, and you can load your CSS or your JavaScript in there as well. But the title is the one that's most important, and the title is always required. You aren't required to have any other tags inside your head other than the title. And then body indicates the content in the main browser window. So again, here's what our basic HTML page looks like. Let's talk about some text elements. So text elements provide structure to the text on your page. So, you've got words, presumably, on your web page. You want to give some structure to those words. So you want to provide some structure to your document. The content inside of text elements should only be text. You can have other elements as well, but generally inside of a text element, you only want text inside those elements. Browsers do provide some minimal default styling for text elements, but it can all be changed via CSS, and generally the default styling isn't going to be enough. It's not quite going to be what you want, but it does kind of take some hints based on what your content is, or based on what the text element is, and it'll kind of do some default styling for you. So headings. So HTML has 6 levels of headings, H1 through H6. So you can think of H1 as like that's the biggest, that's the main heading, and then everything under that is a subheading. So H2 would be a subheading of an H1, H3 would be a subheading of an H2, so on and so forth. So it's kind of a tiered structure there. The browser by default will render different sized headings as different font sizes. So your headings generally are going to be bold, at least for like H1, H2, and H3, I think. By the time you get to H4, I don't think they're bold anymore by default. But the browser will make H1 the biggest, and as the level of heading decreases, the font size will decrease by default. Again, you're probably going to want to change this, the font size of those, but by default, the browser will kind of do that for you. Again, H1 is the largest, used for main headings, and H6 is the smallest. Headings should always be structured. It's very important, even just kind of understanding conceptually what the design of HTML is. You shouldn't have an H2 unless it comes after or nested after an H1. So again, it kind of semantics, right? So like if you just have an H3 out of nowhere and there's no other headings on your page, that H3, what's it a subheading of? You don't know. It doesn't have, you've kind of lost some structure there. So your headings, even if an H1 by default is too big and you say, oh, I want that smaller, don't make it smaller by changing the heading level. Make it smaller using our CSS and say, no, I want H1s to be smaller. So again, think of the HTML as the structure of your document, not the styling of your document. So the structure meaning that you have your H1. Any subheadings could be H2s. Subheadings of H2s can be H3s. Subheadings of H3s can be H4s, so on and so forth. That provides the best structure to your document. Especially if you think of a screen reader, if someone's, viewing your page in a screen reader and it all of a sudden says, heading 3, they're going to be like, okay, well, where was heading 1 and heading 2? Think of the structure and the structure of your content, not the styling. We can always change the font size. That's no problem. So don't change the level of heading just to affect the font size. Very important. Paragraphs. So P tags wrap around individual paragraphs of text. It's a really common tag to use. Paragraphs by default will be separated by a line break and a little bit of margin. So if you have multiple paragraphs, together, your browser won't just let that text all run together. It'll break out each paragraph into its own line and provide a little bit of margin between those. So again, if you were to write a document using, headings and paragraphs, it's going to be pretty readable by default just because of the default styling that your browser gives. Bold and italic. So these are a little bit of outdated tags at this point, but we still want to cover them. So the B tag will make text appear bold by default. Bold can be used to indicate a section of text that should appear different, such as key features or important words. You've heard me talk a lot about how the HTML should only provide the structure and not the style. The B and the I tag are kind of coming from before that was as important. HTML used to be a little bit more based on the style as well, so bold and italic were really common. Now we're moving away. We're trying to separate the structure and the style even more over the last 5 or 10 years, and so bold and italics, they may even be deprecated. I can't remember if they're kind of on the list of things that are going away in the next few years. But so anyway, B for bold, I for italic. However, we still use these tags sometimes to indicate text that should appear different, such as keywords or key features or important words. Same with italics. Kind of indicate something that should be said differently, something that should be emphasized in a certain way. We'll talk, there's some alternatives to these that are a little bit better for modern HTML, but it's still important to know that those tags exist, and by default your browser will render them as bold and italic. Superscript and subscripts. Some of these are not necessarily really commonly used, but they're still good to know. So sup used for characters that are superscript, so like EMC squared or something like that is a superscript, or subscript where the character is kind of below the main character. Again, you might not use them all that often, but they're good to know that we have them. So web browsers by default will collapse white space within an HTML document. That's why we can do our own indentation based on the structure of our page. You can add line breaks in your HTML, or you can add indentations in your HTML, and the browser doesn't really care. It doesn't change the way that your page looks at all. You can, add two pages worth of blank lines, and your page is still going to render correctly because the browser removes all of that extra white space. So again, more than one space, as well as line breaks, will only be treated as one space. So it's important that we kind of think about how we can mitigate that if you want to space things out a little bit. So a couple things to be aware of. BR will manually insert a new line. It stands for break. So BR stands for break or break tag, and it will manually insert a new line on your page. So if you've got some text or you've got something that you want broken out into multiple lines, you can use a BR to do so. However, again, kind of soapbox issue, you should use BRs very sparingly. If you're using the appropriate tags for your content, you shouldn't really need to add extra new lines very often. There are a few cases where you might want to if you're doing some forms. Form elements by default will kind of display inline, or links as well could display inline, and maybe you want to break those out into new lines. those are some valid use cases for BR tags. But generally, you want to avoid them as much as you can. That should be kind of your last resort because it doesn't have any content. It doesn't have anything to do with the content of your page. It's just kind of a random tag. We want to use our styling to, do the styling, not the HTML. You should especially never use multiple BRs in a row to create large empty spaces. Something really common I'll see with student assignments, if you want to create some space between some paragraphs or a space between an image and some links or something, use multiple BR tags in a row because each one adds a new line. So you could add a couple of inches of space using multiple BR tags. Don't do that. If you ever have more than one BR tag in a row, you're doing something wrong. There are better ways to accomplish what you're trying to do than with multiple BR tags because they're very imprecise, right? Like, so you can't specify how much space. And think of a screen reader. It's going to read those BR tags out. So the screen reader, user is going to be listening to your content and it's going to say break, 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 and that, you don't want that. There's no need for that. So don't use lots of BR tags. Use them very, very sparingly. If your assignments never have a BR tag in them at all, that's great. You don't need them. They're kind of a last resort. There are a few times where, they're useful, but generally you want to avoid them. HRs are kind of nice. They'll insert a line break as well as a horizontal line. So it stands for horizontal rule. Kind of help you understand what that stands for. It'll do kind of a horizontal line across the page. Kind of useful for, if you have multiple sections of your page or you want to kind of break things out with a horizontal line. HR is a nice tag to use. You can do some styling to it as well in your CSS. By default, it sort of looks kind of inset. It has kind of a 3D look to it, but you can change that however you want with our CSS. The break tag and the horizontal rule tag are known as empty elements or self-closing tags. You'll notice, we don't have an opening tag and closing tag. We just have the tag name and the space and a slash. So that's what's known as an empty element or a self-closing tag. They don't require a closing tag because they have no content inside them, right? So our opening and our closing tag are used to kind of wrap content. But since we don't have any actual content in these tags, we don't need a closing tag, so it's just kind of all combined into one. Any questions so far? Okay. Semantic elements. So again, kind of, I've been talking a lot about this, but semantic elements are specific elements in your HTML that are not really intended to be structural, but they're to add some meaning to your content. So they may have some default styling, but again, we're more concerned about the semantics that they provide, about the meaning they provide about your content. So we can style them however we want through our CSS. So again, the primary purpose is not style. They should only be used when they're enhancing the meaning of the content. So for example, if you want to make a heading bold, don't use strong, which is one of these tags we'll talk about, but you'd use a heading tag and you'd style it however you want. So again, don't worry about the style, worry about the content and the structure. And in the case of these elements, the meaning that it adds to your content. So strong and emphasis. So strong indicates that a content has strong importance. So by default, browsers will style them as bold. So strong is the replacement for the bold tag. It kind of makes sense. Bold, the B tag, is really specific in the style that it's supposed to be, right? It's bold. It's a bold tag. But a better, more semantic, a more meaningful way of expressing that is with strong. So generally, strong, we will style it as bold, but there are other ways to style strong meaning, right? You could change the color. You could add an underline if you wanted. You could change the font size or something. There's other ways to style strong, emphasized text. So that's why we're replacing bold, which is limited to just bold, with strong, which is more meaningful. Similarly, we have M, which indicates that content should have emphasis that subtly changes the meaning of a sentence. So like, I think Ivy was the first, or I think Ivy was the first, or I think Ivy was the first. Those are all said a little bit different based on where you have the emphasis of the sentence. So again, by default, most browsers will style emphasis tags as italics, same as the I tag, but the emphasis tag gives a little bit more meaning. You're indicating that there's emphasis, not just that it should be displayed in italics. So, important key distinctives. Use strong and M instead of bold and I as much as you can. So yeah, again, it's preferred to use those semantic tags rather than bold or I because they're more descriptive of the meaning of the content, better for your HTML structure. And then you'll use your CSS to style. Again, by default, the styling is the same as bold and I, but we can adjust it a little bit more. Yeah, good question?
So the does it change any sort of visual side?
It makes it italic by default.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Yeah. It's the same as italics as the I tag. Good question. Okay, quotations. So block quote can be used for longer quotes that will take an entire paragraph. So, think of like a magazine and it might have a block quote in the middle of an article that's kind of offset a little bit differently or styled differently to indicate that that whole paragraph is a quote. So you can use block quote for that. You generally still need to use the paragraph tag inside of a block quote to indicate if you have paragraph text inside a block quote, you still want a P tag inside of your block quote. Q can be used for shorter quotes that sit in line with the paragraph. So more, all it really does is it adds quotation marks around the content. So again, block quote is for an entire paragraph. Q is for a quote within an existing paragraph. You can also use the cite attribute to provide a URL with some more information about the source of the quotation. So for instance, like this, so you've got our block quote. You can use cite equals and then a URL inside quotes to kind of provide the source of your quote. So in this case, Wikipedia. So the cite attribute can either be on your block quote element or on your Q element. So in this case, we've got a block quote with our cite. Inside of that is the paragraph with our quote. So you think about it, a block quote could be multiple paragraphs. If we're quoting more than one paragraph, we have this paragraph. We could have another paragraph tag also inside this block quote, however many we need for the entire quote. Any questions about quotations? Okay. Abbreviation is used for abbreviations and acronyms, so ABBR. You can use the title attribute on the opening tag to specify the full term. So, for instance, if you use ABBR for prof, you would use title equals professor to give the full length term of the abbreviation. When you hover over the term, the browser will show the full term in a tooltip, which is kind of nice. So the user can hover over the text and it'll show what the abbreviation is. Cite can be used to list a reference. So similar to the cite attribute we talked about before, there's an actual cite element you can use as well. So say you just have some paragraphs of text and it's not necessarily a direct quote, but you do need to provide a citation like you would in an essay or a paper. You can use the cite element to provide a reference. DFN can be used when explaining or defining a term for the first time, so it stands for definition. So think of like a textbook, when they will have a key term for the first time, they'll have it bold to kind of indicate it's a key term. So you can use DFN to indicate that you're kind of providing a definition. So again, it doesn't actually have the definition in it, it's just kind of in line with your definition. You would wrap the term in DFN. So here we're saying, by using this DFN tag around the internet, we're saying that we're defining the internet in this text. So again, a good example of so the browser by default will, some browsers do it in italic, some browsers don't, we could use an italic tag here, but that doesn't really provide any meaning to it, right? If we just had an I tag around the internet, it's not indicating to the browser that we're defining something, it's just saying rendered in italics. But by using definition, we're really clear about what we're doing, which is we're providing a definition. So it's a much more useful tag than just I. But again, we probably have to style it on our own with our CSS because not all browsers will style it the same way. So one of the biggest issues we run into in web development is, browsers handling different elements slightly differently, or handling different CSS rules slightly differently, just kind of based on their interpretation of how they're supposed to be done. Okay, so some more tags. So address can be used to wrap a physical address or a phone number or a web URL or an email address of some sort. So really it can be anything that's considered an address. It doesn't really matter what, it doesn't have to be an actual mailing address. It can be a web address, so on and so forth. But it's just to indicate that you're providing some sort of content about how you would get in touch with someone or a business, etc. The rest of these are not very common, but you can use insert or INS to show content that's been inserted into a document. Usually it's underlined, but it's kind of a way of saying, this content is new or has been inserted. So you think of like you might see this sometimes on like an e-commerce website if the prices have been updated. You might have, $4.99, but then after that sale, $3.99. And that sale $3.99 part might use that insert tag to show that this has been inserted. This isn't typically part of the content, but it's been inserted here maybe temporarily to show some difference. Kind of similarly, you can use del or delete to show content that has been deleted from a document. So maybe you cross off the old price, right? Like, so $4.99 is crossed out, $3.99 is underlined. You might use delete to indicate that $4.99, you still want to show it on your page because you want to show some of the history of your price, right? But you want it to be crossed out. You want it to be clear that it's been deleted. So again, I've actually used this quite a bit, for some sort of application where you can remove things, or you can I've used this for a to-do app where you can mark things off your to-do list. For me, I like to still see the things that I've accomplished. I don't like it when to-do apps just disappear the ones that I've checked off. I want to see all the things that I've gotten done because it makes me feel good. So I'll use the delete tag around those items that have been checked to show that they've been removed, even though they're still visible. S can be used to show content that is no longer accurate or relevant, but should not be deleted. So again, another example. You could really, any of these are relevant for this type of example, but you can also use S, which is short for strike through. So it's just going to cross off anything that's inside it with a strike through. Any questions? These are not necessarily ones that you'll use super often, but it's good to know that they exist. Okay, lists are hugely important. We use lists all the time. So we have ordered lists where each item in the list begins with an ordered number. So examples are like recipe steps or a table of contents or something like that, where the order of your list is important and you want to indicate that this is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3. And again, each item would be prefaced with a number. Unordered list, however, is more of just like a bullet point, right? So the order doesn't necessarily matter as much. You don't want them numbered 1, 2, 3. You just want a bulleted list. That would be an unordered list. Definition list consists of terms with corresponding definitions. So rather than like a bullet point or something, you have like a term, and then you have a definition following it, but it's a list of multiple ones of those. Lists can also be nested inside of each other, which is pretty useful. I'll show you some examples here in a second. So here's an example of an ordered list. So OL is used, it's short for ordered list. OL will wrap the entire list, and then LI, which stands for list item, will wrap each individual list item. So again, we've got the OL that wraps the entire thing, and then each item is an LI. LI is for all types of lists, well, other than definition lists, but both ordered and unordered lists use LIs. It's the wrapping tag that makes the difference between ordered and unordered. So in this example, our items are numbered 1 and 2. There's some, you can use CSS to change how it's ordered. So you could change it to like Roman numerals or ABC, that kind of thing. You can actually change that via CSS, but the default is just 1, 2, 3. But generally, an ordered list is anything where the order does actually matter, and you want it to be prefaced with some sort of order indicator. Unordered lists use the UL tag, short for unordered list. That tag will wrap the entire list, and then again, li wraps each item. And here we've just got bullet points instead of numbers. Similarly with CSS, you can change the type of list item marker as well. So you can change it, you could change, there's different styles of bullet points available, so you can do like an open circle. I think you can do like a star or like a dash, those kinds of things. You can even provide your own image to use for the bullet if you want to, really customize your bullet points. Or you can say no bullet points at all, just show the list, and maybe add some spacing around each item or something like that. So there's plenty of options as far as what your bullet points are. So again, don't think as much about, a bullet point, a bulleted list, but an unordered list that then you can style however you want. So again, we're getting back to the HTML is providing our structure and our content, not necessarily our styling. The styling is all provided by CSS. Definition lists are also useful. So DL will wrap the entire list, short for definition list, which will include pairs of DT and DD items. So DT stands for definition term, and it provides the term being defined. So in this first example, DL wraps the entire list. DT, HTML is the first term we're defining, and then it's followed by DD, which is dictionary definition, and includes the definition of our term. So DT for the term, DD for the definition. And then you just have multiple pairs of those. So rather than like LI or something like that, you just have multiple pairs of DTs and DDs. So for CSS, we've got our DT and then our DD with the definition. Then we close our definition list. By default, the browsers will style the definition indented a little bit. So it'll have the term and then it'll have the definition indented like this. So term and definition. So it's actually pretty useful if you have a list where there's kind of corresponding terms and definitions. We'll actually use this quite a bit, where it's not necessarily just a bulleted list, but it's still a list of content with pairs of words. Any questions about lists so far? And again, you can have them nested too. So, inside of our DD here, we could have an unordered list inside of this DD tag if there were multiple, definitions of CSS or something like that. We could have our DD, and then over here have a UL, LI, 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 close our UL, close our DD. You can definitely do that. And then inside here where it says cascading style sheets, it would just have a bulleted list here. So that's kind of where the power of lists come in, especially if you need nested lists and kind of sub-lists, sub-bullet points, so on and so forth. You can do that by just nesting your lists together. Okay, let's talk about links. Links are very important to the internet, obviously. We use an A element to create links. Content in between the opening A tag and the closing A tag is the clickable text of the link. So the part that you actually see and that you can click on. We use an href attribute to indicate the page the link should take you to. So for example, we've got our A, href equals, and then the actual URL that we want to go to. And then we close our opening tag. We have the text that you actually see and can click on. In this case, click here, and then our closing A tag to close it out. So anything that goes inside of this opening and closing A tag is the part you can click on. So sometimes that might be an image. You might even have, I don't know, you could have a list and maybe each list item is inside of an A, something along those lines. You can put all kinds of stuff inside that A tag that you want to be clickable where the user can click on it and go to another page. Links are typically styled as blue and underlined by default. And then they'll turn purple once they've been clicked. So you can actually change all of that. You can change, what color the link is. You can also change what color it is after it's already been visited. if you want that functionality. Okay, let's talk a little bit about URLs. So when you're linking to a different website, the value of the href attribute needs to be an absolute URL when you're linking to a different website than yours, which is a full web address that starts with HTTP or HTTPS and includes the domain name and everything. So, http://google.com, that's an absolute URL to google.com. Clicking that link will take you outside of the current web page the user's viewing and take them to a different web page. Really important that we kind of understand the difference. However, when you're linking to a different page within the same site, the href attribute can be a relative URL, which is kind of more of a shorthand address that only includes the path and file name, and it's relevant to your current file. So an absolute URL says, here's the website you're going to. It's outside of the current page. But a relative URL is just the path and file name. It doesn't include the HTTP or the domain name or anything. So for example, here we have an href which is aboutus.html. That will fill in whatever page you're currently on, the domain and everything, before the file name. So if you're on craighh.com/home.html and you click this link, it'll go to craighh.com/aboutus.html. See what I'm saying? So it goes to within the same domain, within the same site, but just a different page on that site. Pretty important that we understand that. And you may have run into this if you did the extra credit for the first assignment to do a picture. If you had used a relative URL for your picture, you had to make sure you included your file and your GitHub stuff. Otherwise, the file wouldn't show up. Same with you could have an absolute URL that's like file:// which indicates that it's a local file, but that's not going to work when you're viewing the page on the actual GitHub sites because it doesn't have access to your local files at that point. So anyway, pretty important that we understand the difference between an absolute URL, which includes HTTP, the full domain name, and a relative URL, which is just a file name or a path relative to the current page. So again, relative URLs are relative to the current file's location. So whatever file you have open, it's relative to where that file is within your directory structure. So if you're linking to a page within the same folder, so say you have a folder, pages, and you've got home.html and then aboutus.html, you can just provide the file name and it'll go to that file as long as it's inside the same folder. However, if you're linking to a page in a child folder, so a folder within the folder of the current page, you want to provide that folder information. So subpages/aboutus.html. That'll go to the subpages folder and then the aboutus.html file within that. Similarly, you can link to a page in a parent folder or a folder a level above the folder of your current page using .. So .. will go up a directory in your file structure. So, if you're in a folder that has your home.html, and then in the parent folder, so up a level in your directory, you have your about us, you want to use .. You can actually chain multiple .. together as well. Each .. goes up one level. So you can use as many of those as you need to get to whatever folder it is that you want to load a page from. We won't really have to mess with these within this class because most of the sites we're going to do are only one page. We're not going to have multiple pages with our sites for the most part. So you don't have to worry about it too much, but it's important to know, especially if you have, if you use like a photos folder or something, when you are pulling in the URL for your images, you'll need to use, a relative URL to where those images are located if they're in a subfolder for wherever your main pages are. Any questions about relative URLs? Okay, it's kind of one of those things that makes sense once you use it a little bit too. Okay, so some other types of links. So we can use mail to links, which will open the user's email program with a new email to the target email address. So it's still an A because it's something we're going to click on. It's a link. But within our href, instead of a URL, we have mail to then colon, and then the email address that we want to send an email to. So super useful. My only gripe with this, and I actually try not to use it too much, is that when you click email Craig, it's going to open up whatever your computer's default mail program is. So like for me, there's like the Apple Mail app, which I don't use. I use Gmail, right? So anytime I click one of these links, it opens up the Mail app, which I don't have set up, and it opens a new window, and I have to quit it, and then I have to like copy, right click and click copy email, and then go to Gmail. So if you're gonna use these, what I prefer to do is you can still use the mail to, but instead of just like the person's name, put the actual email address inside the A. So it's still a link, and usually people understand that if you click a link that's an email address, it's going to open up, your mail program. But by putting the actual email address as the clickable part, it gives them a chance to copy, that email address and actually see what the email is. So also, it's not usually super clear when you have a mail to link. You have this link that says email Craig. That could open up a new page that has a form on it where you could fill out an email. It's not really clear that it's going to be a mail to link. But if you have an email address, it's usually pretty understandable that that's a mail to link, and it's going to open up your mail program, whatever that is. So anyway, my recommendation is to actually put the email address there. You can do whatever you want, but it's good to know how to use that mail to. You can also use the target attribute, which will force a link to open in a new window tab. So that's also super useful. So we've got a regular link here with an href to Google. We use target, and then underscore blank indicates a new tab or a new window. It used to be new window, but now most browsers will open a new tab if you give it blank. So that's really nice. If you want to open up some sort of reference page, or you're linking the user outside of your site for some reason. Maybe it's a link to your Facebook page or something like that. You want it to open up in a new tab because you want the user to come back to your website. You're not necessarily navigating them within your site. You just want to kind of kick open a new tab for the user to see some information. A third thing you can do is use the # at the end of an href to link to a specific ID element on a page. So, for instance, we've got href and we use # about us. And then about us text to actually link to that part of our site. So if it's relative, meaning if it doesn't have HTTP, it's just within your current page. And then we'll talk about how to provide an ID, but there's an ID attribute. So whatever element on your page has this ID attribute, it'll jump down to it when they click the link. So that's really useful if you want some navigation, within the same web page. You can use that to kind of jump to certain parts of the page. You can also do, there's some JavaScript and stuff you can do that'll let you scroll there or something like that. They'll do some more interesting stuff. You can also jump to a specific page of another website by using the same format. So we can have an absolute URL with the domain and everything, and then the #, and then your ID, and it'll jump to that portion of that page, which is pretty useful. So if you want to link, I'll use this sometimes for like Wikipedia articles, which can be kind of long. If I want to send someone a link to a specific part of a Wikipedia article, you can do that. Any questions? Okay. That's the end of this lecture. I'll show you an example real quick of like the linking. We have this on a website I work on. Zimride.com has some navigation at the top. So this is one long page, which is kind of a common practice now, right? Like we want to kind of provide as much information on one page as we can. So we've got a long page here with lots of information on it. So, we've got these links up here that just will scroll you to different parts of that page. So as you click on each one, it scrolls you down. If you look at it using our handy inspect element, here's the A for that. You notice I used a list here. I I use an unordered list for these links. So it's sort of a list of links, right? So kind of a semantic thing to do. We're indicating we've got several links here in a list, so we use UL for that and LIs for each list item. We've changed the styling, obviously, to make them, display inline like that and not like your traditional list would be. But then we've got our link here, and our href is just the pound join, which indicates that we want to jump to that specific part. Now we've got some JavaScript that does more fancy things that provides that scroll. By default, you won't get that scroll. In fact, I think if I get rid of this class here, it'll do the default. What's that? This one. Yeah, it's still jumping to it. But by default, it's just going to immediately jump down to that section. It's not going to do the fancy scroll. So then if we look, if I inspect this guy, should be able to see the ID. So right here, this is a section. We haven't learned this element yet, but it's got an ID attribute. You can probably barely see this, but ID equals join. So that's what matches that pound sign value. So you can jump to any part of your page that's got an ID like that. Okay. Any other questions?